last week, Santikaro discussed some of the teachings of his teacher, Buddhadasa. And I hope many of you had a chance to either attend that or look at the recording, or both. But prior to that, we were talking about the precepts, and we had covered the first 5 prohibitory precepts, which are considered the essential precepts for lay people. The other 5 prohibitory precepts are a bit more specialized. And I think we'll take a break from the precepts for now, and come back to them at another time. Not a break from practicing them, mind you, but a break from talking about them. So I think we'll then maybe expand a bit, or at least I just want to share my thoughts about some of the things that Santikaro talked about. I can't begin to bring to it the scholarship that he possesses regarding the early Buddhist teachings, and the particular teachings of Buddhadasa. But they did arouse some inquiry in my mind, and I'd just like to share some of that with you this morning, and hopefully generate some discussion. I'd like to focus on the topic of samsara, which Santikaro spent a fair amount of time discussing last week. Samsara, the cycle of birth and death. Literally, the word, as I understand it, means wandering around or wandering through. And Buddhadasa puts a prefix on it that is like vati samsara, which emphasizes the cyclic movement of samsara. Samsara also has a connotation of aimlessness, like aimlessly wandering around. And the Buddha did not come up with this term. It was a well-established concept in Hinduism long before the Buddha. In the Upanishads, they talk about samsara, and they're referring to the notion of rebirth. The idea that there is something which they called an Atman that is basically occupies physical bodies. And the Atman is a personal thing that is stable and passes from one physical body to the next. In a sense, wandering through what are termed the 6 realms. The 6 realms. So the 6 realms in Buddhism are the heavenly realm where the devas live, and the human realm where we are, and the animal realm, the realm of asuras or fighting spirits, the realm of hungry ghosts, just dominated by greed, insatiable. And then the 6th would be the hell realm. And in the traditional Hindu perspective, as I understand it, one would, as a human, be looking to the future, to future lives in one of these realms, and where you ended up depended in part on your behavior. on how much merit or demerit you accumulated during the course of your life. And the Buddha didn't actually directly upturn this whole idea of rebirth, and in fact discussed it. It was felt an important notion to sort of keep people on good behavior, if nothing else. And it was widely believed at the time. But in a sense, the Buddha subverted this whole notion by coming up with the concept of anatman or anatta, anatman, that there really wasn't anything that was just stable, permanent, and personal that passed from body to body. That all of it was subject to causes and conditions. So that there wasn't any essential essence there. And when you throw out the concept of Atman, it gets difficult to explain what it is exactly that goes from one body to the next. So the whole notion of rebirth or reincarnation becomes a little bit problematic. And this has been discussed at length over many centuries, and we aren't going to resolve that today. But I guess I would make the case that it doesn't really matter. There are individuals who believe that if you're going to be a thoroughgoing Buddhist, you need to believe in rebirth. My reading of the Buddhist teachings is that he wasn't really inviting people to believe things that they just didn't believe. He was inviting people to inquire, to see what their own experience yielded. And for those who have a personal experience of past lives, and there are many such people, I wouldn't dare contest their experience, but I just say that I haven't had it myself, so I have to remain uncertain about the validity of that notion. But as I say, I don't think it really matters because there are many good reasons to be on what we might term good behavior and to practice the precepts and not just accumulation of merit for future lives. In fact, in the Mahayana tradition, the whole notion of samsara was morphed. And this is true, as you can see from some of Dogen's writings in the 13th century in Japan, which we'll get to in a minute, but you can also see this many centuries before Dogen, in actually the 2nd century CE, Nagarjuna. And I'll just bring up a couple quotes from Nagarjuna to illustrate. Nagarjuna was or Nagarjuna, I'm not sure exactly how it's properly pronounced, was a 2nd or 3rd century Indian philosopher who wrote prodigiously and had a profound effect on subsequent Mahayana thinking and teaching. But he says startlingly that samsara is nothing essentially different from nirvana. nirvana is nothing essentially different from samsara. The realm of nirvana is the realm of samsara. Between the two, there is not the slightest difference whatsoever. So in traditional Hindu teaching, as I understand it, the samsara, the cycle of rebirth and coming back in various realms, could be terminated in a state of nirvana in which one becomes one with Brahma. So nirvana was a lot different from samsara. And samsara was sort of the stage for endless suffering. And nirvana was the stage for endless bliss. But Nagarjuna is saying, really, there's no difference. What does he mean? What's he talking about? So Master Dogen, a millennium later, comments on this issue in this way. Now, you need to know that Dogen used the word shoji as a substitute for samsara. And shoji is it's a compound word in Japanese that means essentially birth, death. And so it's translated as birth and death. So when Dogen is referring to birth and death, he is essentially referring to this cycle of samsara as he understands it. He says those who want to become free from birth and death should understand the meaning of these words. If you search for a Buddha outside of birth and death, it will be like trying to go south when you're with your spear heading towards the north, or like trying to see the Big Dipper while you are facing south. You will cause yourself to remain all the more in birth and death and miss the way to emancipation. So Dogen seems to be saying here that actually the gateway to emancipation is through this toil of birth and death, through samsara. He goes on in a fascicle called Shoji, Birth and Death, and says, just understand that birth and death is itself nirvana, exactly what Nagarjuna was saying. There is nothing such as birth and death to be avoided, and there is nothing such as nirvana to be sought. Only when you realize this are you free from birth and death. So samsara takes on some subtlety in Mahayana teachings. And with the realization that there is no Atman, there is no essential, unchanging, permanent, independent self, we are, in a sense, going through birth and death all the time. And that becomes most apparent when we stop and look, which is what Zazen is, to stop and look. And we can see in each moment the arising, persisting, and ceasing, the thoughts arising, persisting, and ceasing, the feelings arising, persisting, and ceasing, the little pain arising, persisting, and ceasing, the tightness perhaps in our chest arising, persisting, and ceasing, coming and going constantly, always in constant flux. And Dogen seems to be saying that if you can really understand this process, then it loses its power over you. And that is what he defines as nirvana, freedom, liberation, emancipation. And going back to Buddhadasa, Buddhadasa says similar things with different words. He says the way to overcome this vati samsara, this aimlessly cycling around, is to develop a fuller understanding, to develop what he calls all-around understanding, a 360-degree view, or you might say a 30,000-foot view of what's going on. And it's not necessary to have a teacher really explain this, because Zazen teaches it. Sitting and quietly watching mind teaches this, the nature of arising and ceasing. Only when you don't avoid birth and death or long for it do you enter a Buddha's mind, Dogen says. However, do not analyze or speak about it. Just set aside your body and mind, forget about them, throw them in the house of Buddha. Then all is done by the Buddha. When you follow this, you are free from birth and death and become a Buddha without effort or scheme. Throwing yourself into the house of Buddha and sitting Zazen are, in this case, equivalent. All is done by Buddha. Stopping, looking, paying attention. And then Dogen concludes, rather remarkably, this little fascicle called Shoji. There is a simple way to become a Buddha. When you refrain from unwholesome actions, are not attached to birth and death, and are compassionate toward all sentient beings, respectful to seniors and kind to juniors, not excluding or desiring anything, with no thoughts or worries, you will be called a Buddha. Seek nothing else. This this little passage brought a smile to my mind when it talks about respectful to seniors and kind to juniors, because during this past week, taking advantage of retirement, I went to my first actual violin lesson. And my teacher there was about 1/3 my age. But during my violin lesson of half an hour, he was my senior, I was the junior. So we exchanged these roles of senior and junior all the time. And really the message is to be compassionate toward all sentient beings, being respectful and kind to everyone, no matter what role you're particularly occupying at that moment. So Zazen, as we notice the breath, inhaling and exhaling, taking in and letting go, taking in and letting go, and seeing that this is an illustration of everything else. So I think I'll stop there, and we can break into groups. I did want to mention one thing. Let me do this while you're all here. That Carol and I, talking things over, decided that it might be a good idea to just take a break in August. Taking a cue from, she's involved with various groups in Europe, and they all shut down in August. Everybody takes a holiday in August. So I'm not suggesting taking a break from practice. I'm suggesting that we'll take a break from Saturdays in the month of August. We will still have a gathering on August 14th, but we will plan on, after completing the next 2 Saturdays, taking an August break and resuming in September. I think this can sometimes be invigorating. It can sometimes bring a fresh spirit when we return. So we'll give it a try and see how it goes this year. After having done these really without any kind of break for 12 years. So we'll break into groups now, and
excuse me, Will. So
yeah.
The gathering tomorrow is still scheduled.
Oh,
right?
yes, it is. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, it is. It
And
is
then
still.
the next one will be August 14 after tomorrow.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much. So